Well, thank you so much, Daniel. I appreciate that. I can't get all of that, the 700 and some pages, within 45 minutes, but I'm going to break this down, and I'm going to try to make it really, really simple. So simple that even an American can understand. And I'm only going to consider our finest source for Jesus' resurrection. So our best source when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus is Paul. He's our ace. And there's good reason for that. Let's give you a few here. There are 13 letters of Paul in the New Testament, and of those, 7 of them are considered by scholars to be undisputed. That is, it's undisputed that he wrote them. And then there are 6 that are disputed hotly. And of those 6, 2 of them are, a slight majority would say Paul wrote them, and then there are 4 of them that the majority would say Paul did not write them. Now, I'm not commenting one way or the other on whether he wrote them. That's irrelevant for this talk. I don't want to get bogged down on that. But here's the thing. I'm only going to appeal to the undisputed letters of Paul here. So I'm going to use Paul, who is perhaps our earliest author in the New Testament, and I'm only going to use his undisputed letters. So that means a critic can't come back and say, oh, well, Paul didn't write that. Or the Gospels contradict one. All right, I'm not doing the Gospels here. If you want to know about gospel contradictions, I wrote a book just published by Oxford, and it's called Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? I deal with that kind of stuff, all right? But we're just focusing on, we're asking the question, did Jesus rise from the dead? Not anything about the Gospels. I'm looking at Paul, who wrote before the Gospels, and I'm only appealing to his undisputed letters. All right, now, here's what we find in Galatians. It's one of those. This may have been the first piece, the first letter in the New Testament. Maybe not. We don't know exactly when it was dated. It was either Galatians or 1 Thessalonians. And in Galatians chapter 2, verses 1 through 10, Paul says he's going up to the Jerusalem second time since his conversion, and he's meeting with the pillars of the church, he calls them. That's Peter, James, and John. And he says, I met with them because I wanted to run the gospel message. Remember this, the gospel message. I wanted to run the gospel message past them to ensure that I had not been working in vain all these years. In other words, Paul wants to ensure that he's preaching the same gospel message they're preaching. This is Paul saying that Peter, James, and John, the 3 lead apostles in the Jerusalem church, confirmed that he was preaching the same gospel message they were preaching. Now, I'm a student of history, and I know that, we're going to ask the question, why should we trust Paul on this? Maybe Paul was lying. Maybe Paul just made this up in order to, be authoritative, to fake his authority in the church. So, as historians, we look for corroborating data, and we've got some. Did you know that some of the apostles had disciples of their own? Clement of Rome lived in the 1st century, and he knew the Apostle Peter. And then there's a guy named Polycarp. Again, you're going to have babies and stuff. Just remember Polycarp. That's another neat one. So Polycarp was a disciple of the Apostle John. So it'd be interesting to see what these guys have to say about Paul, right? Because Peter and John were the 3, Peter, James, and John. So you got Peter and John and their disciples, Clement and Polycarp. Let's see what they have to say about Paul. And they're writing after Paul's death, after Peter's death, and John's death. And let's just see what they say about Paul. So it's interesting to note that Clement of Rome places Paul on par with his mentor, Peter. That's pretty interesting. And he calls him the Blessed Paul. And then you come to Polycarp, and Polycarp says that Paul accurately and reliably taught the message of truth. And then he quotes from Paul's letters and refers to them as part of the sacred scriptures. Now, these are not things that you would do if Paul was teaching heresy or had gone off track and was teaching something different than your mentors, Peter and John. But it's precisely the kind of things that you would say if Paul had been telling the truth, that when he met with Peter, James, and John, they certified that he was preaching the same gospel message they were preaching. I could give you even more evidence, but I'm limited by time. But I would say this should at least suffice to suggest that when we hear Paul on the gospel message, I'm not saying here that we've proven that everything Paul preached is what they preached and they were all in agreement. I'm not saying that we can prove that, okay? But I'm saying that we've got enough evidence that strongly suggests that when we are hearing Paul on the gospel message, the essentials of the Christian faith, that we are likewise hearing the voice of the Jerusalem apostles. That's pretty cool. So that would mean, even if we didn't have the Gospels at all, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, if somehow we knew what this gospel message was that Paul was preaching, we would know what the disciples of Jesus had been preaching. Now, wouldn't it be great then if some archaeologists were digging around in Jerusalem or somewhere, Caesarea, and they found some lost letters of Paul? We don't have all Paul's letters. What we have in 1st and 2nd Corinthians, it's actually 2nd and 4th Corinthians. We're missing 2 of Paul's letters. We might be missing more. Paul talks about the letter to the church at Laodicea. And what? What's that? So what if we discovered one of these letters? And what if in one of those letters, Paul said something like, hey, I understand you were reading a copy of my letter that I sent to the church at Rome, and you started arguing with one another about what I meant by predestination and election, and I'd like to resolve that for you in this letter. That'd be kind of cool, wouldn't it? Wouldn't it be great if in that lost letter that we found of Paul, he said, hey, I want to remind you all of the gospel message I preached to you. Man, that would be historical gold, wouldn't it? Because we could look at that. If he provided the gospel message, we'd be able to say, hey, we can know for certain what the Jerusalem apostles were preaching regarding Jesus. Well, guess what? We don't have to wait for a lost letter. We've already got it. It's 1 Corinthians. And it's 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 1. Paul says, hey, I want to remind you, brothers, of the gospel message I preached to you. And now he's going to remind them of it. It's pretty cool. Jesus is probably crucified in the year 30 or 33, and Paul establishes the church in Corinth around the year 49, and maybe shortly thereafter, 51 perhaps. And then just a year or a couple years after that, he writes 1 Corinthians to them, or actually what we call 1 Corinthians, but is actually 2 Corinthians. He's writing that letter to them that we have. And in that letter that he's writing, within 25 years or less of the crucifixion of Jesus, he says, I want to remind you of the gospel message I preached to you. And just a few years before is when he appeared before those Jerusalem apostles, and they certified this message being true around the year 49. So we're only talking about 2, 3, 4, 5 years later. Now, here it is. He says, I delivered to you what I also received. Now, those two terms, delivered and received, connote the imparting of oral tradition. Back then, probably only about 10% of the people were literate. Only 10% could read, and maybe only half of those could write. So they learned through oral tradition, and it wasn't like the game of telephone where you have an unimportant sentence given one time to children who quickly and playfully pass it along to one another in an uncontrolled manner. That's not how oral tradition worked. There's been a lot of work and scholarship done on oral tradition over the past 60-some years, and we've gone far beyond that. And this was very important stuff to them. I had a kindergarten teacher tell me once, I play the game of telephone with my kids, and they get it all wrong. And so then I say to them, all right, we're going to do this again. And this time you get it perfect, or there's no recess. And they get it perfect every time. Why? Because even 5-year-olds can get it right when they're interested in it, when it becomes important to them. Well, for these people living under the iron hand of Rome, the hope of eternal life could not have been more important. They're hanging on every word of Jesus. There's so much I could say about oral tradition here, but I got to move on. So Paul's saying that here we have oral tradition, and Paul talks elsewhere how tradition, just like it was with the Jews of old, it was with the church that was domiciled in Jerusalem, that tradition came from Jerusalem. the Jerusalem church. So Paul is getting this on the authority from the Jerusalem apostles. I delivered to you, Corinthians, in the year 51, what I had also received from the Jerusalem leadership. And now we're about ready to get here an outline of the gospel message that he was preaching. Now this is small font, and I'll tell you why it is in a moment. It says that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures, and that he appeared. Now the reason this is small font, because I wanted to see the format in which this appears. It would be this way in Greek as well. This is called parallelism. And when you're talking oral tradition, there were things that they would incorporate, like chiasms and crea, parallelism, all these kinds of things in order to assist one in memorizing things. That's why Jesus used hyperbolic language at times. Unless you hate your father and mother and your closest family members, you can't be my disciple. If your eye causes you to lust, rip it out and throw it from you. We don't really forget those kinds of things, but that's hyperbolic shock language. To assist in memory. Well, so was parallelism. Long, short, long, short. There's another thing that suggests to us it's oral tradition. And another thing is, after this, he says, whether it's I or they, the other apostles, this is what we preach, and this is what you believe. And the Greek word he uses there for preach is kerugma, from which we have the word kerygma, which would signify the formal public proclamation. This is what is formally publicly proclaimed. Christ died, was buried, was raised, and he appeared.